Good morning and aloha and welcome back, especially a special welcome to those of us joining on this really monumental day for the Winter Clinical Conference. For those of you who were here this morning, you know we had our first half of our live stream event, and this is just absolutely exciting for not only those of you in the audience, but as well as those of you joining us online from far reaches of the country, from different time zones, all the way from the East Coast to the Pacific, for this really monumental inaugural live stream event. And for those of you who were here this morning, you know that this is the first time this has actually been done at a major dermatology conference. So this is really exciting. We're all part of history here today. And we really need to thank Dr. Regal, Dr. Lebwohl, and Dr. Del Rosso for kind of keeping us ahead of the curve in terms of technology when it comes to dermatology education. I think this is a fantastic way for our colleagues who couldn't make it for whatever reason to still be a part of all the excitement we're here for today. I'm Samal Desai. I'm going to be chairing the next session this morning. It's a pleasure to introduce our first panel, chaired by Dr. Regal, Clinical Professor of Dermatology at NYU, Dr. Adelaide Hebert, who's a Professor of Dermatology at UT Houston and a pediatric dermatologist, Dr. Stephen Wang from Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New Jersey, and Josh Zeichner, Director of Cosmetical and Clinical Research at Mount Sinai, to really talk about an exciting discussion in how to motivate our patients to use sunscreen. And I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Regal.
Well, thank you very much, Samal, and it's certainly a pleasure to be here and talk about a topic that's particularly appropriate while we're here in a very UV-intense area, I would say, to do this. We're going to be speaking today with you and give our views on some issues related to sun protection and really the importance of achieving behavioral change. And that's what our panel is going to focus on today, about ways we can motivate our patients to be more sun protective. By way of disclosures, all the panelists have consulted with Neutrogena on this presentation. So let's begin. This is the current melanoma data that just came out this past week from the American Cancer Society for 2018. And what's really interesting with this data is that we see that the incidence of melanoma, the number of cases, has continued to rise, but the mortality rate, the number of deaths from melanoma, has actually fallen now for the second year in a row. And why that's important is that the incidence of melanoma is related to behavior, protecting yourself from the sun, wearing sunscreen, wearing protective clothing, behavioral things. The death rate for melanoma is what we call secondary prevention. That's basically if you have a spot, see your dermatologist early, get it detected early before it's advanced. So what this data suggests to me is that our efforts in secondary prevention and early detection are actually more effective right now than our efforts in primary prevention, and therefore we're not doing what we need to do with behavioral changes to really make a difference. So that's what I see from this data. And this is a paper that just came out in the BJD last month, which I thought was very interesting. They did a calculation, and they determined if we could raise the sunscreen usage in the US 5% a year for 10 years, so 5% annually for 10 years, how many invasive melanomas between now and 2031 could be averted? And it turns out by their calculations, which are very conservative, 230,000 additional melanomas will be averted in that period of time, just by getting 5% more people a year to use sunscreen, which is pretty profound number. Despite the science that's out there, sunscreen compliance is low. Here's a study showing only 30% of men and 30% of women, and 15% of men regularly use sunscreen on their face and exposed skin. And in fact, less than 40% of American households actually buy sunscreen. And despite that, consumers know that sunscreens are important. 9 out of 10 Americans believe that sunscreen is important for protecting a child's health. But more than 4 out of 5 parents, their children don't wear sunscreen on a regular basis. So again, there's that disconnect between the information and the behavior to make a difference. So we're going to talk about today a little bit about the case potentially for a new behavioral approach. And there's a bunch of strategies and motivators that have been out there. Certainly studies showing that if you put the sunscreen next to your water bottle, that would remind you to use it outdoors. The classic one, to put it next to your toothpaste in the morning so you brush your teeth, and in fact, you remember to use your sunscreen. People will use sunscreen if they believe it works, or they believe their friends use it. That's another one of the things. And certainly social media has really not been used very effectively to really amplify the message yet. So we're going to have a panel talking about a couple of questions, how we might be able to change that. And of course, they've been introduced before, but certainly I'm happy to have Bita Hebert, Josh Zeichner, and Steve Wang with us today. And we're all going to give our views on how we tell patients things and what we're going to do, and we'll tee it up with a couple of questions. And the first question I want to pose to the group is, patients tell us all the time reasons I can't use sunscreen for this or I can't use sunscreen for that. So when patients come up with these questions and give you these barriers, how do you overcome them? What are the ways you would get your patients to really start using sunscreen again? And I'll open up to any of you.
Well, I know I treat many children who have atopic dermatitis, and their tolerance to sunscreen is sometimes a real barrier to effective use or even use at all. I have found that the sunscreens that contain only titanium dioxide or zinc oxide are far more well tolerated by that population group, and I advise parents to buy those particular ingredients so that the child will be able to tolerate it, and I think that overcomes a significant barrier. We know those children's skin is more delicate, but it really warrants the same protection that any child's skin would get.
Well, I think you're right. It's certainly not just for kids, but cosmetic elegance is important. I always say the best sunscreen is the one people are going to use, right?
Absolutely.
And if it's cookie or sticky or whatever, they're just not going to do it. Steve?
I mean, I think we have a lot of barriers. We talked about the cosmetic element of it, but there's some of the barriers that's completely overlooked, right? You're looking at the packaging size, and the average size is about 4 ounce and 4 ounce. So we know that we have to use about 1.4 ounce for covering the average adult size. So if somehow the manufacturer can increase the size, and you somehow put in the mind of the individuals, they will use more. You will use more, you will get more protection. Also, I think the idea of the biggest barrier is something we don't talk about. That is, it's not a habit. It's not in everyone's routine. And one of the things I thought about is, thinking about this, a Dale Green study from Australia. They showed it's a daily use of sunscreen with SPF 16 that protected against squamous cell and melanoma. Right? If you look at their sunscreen they were using, it's not very great sunscreen because it's SPF 16, and also they didn't have really good UVA protection. But in my mind, I think another element to this is that they got individual to use the sunscreen every day, right? And at the same time, this sets off the first sort of a domino reaction and get them to act. And they start avoiding the sun, they put on a hat, and they're doing a whole bunch of sequence of action. After 10 years, and they made a difference, right? So I think we need to think in that context, and how do we get people to change? How do we build that habit, right? That's why we did the study looking at putting the sunscreen right next to the toothpaste, and just in 6 weeks in the dead winter, you can increase sunscreen use by 20%.
Well, that's great. Josh, what do your patients say? What are the reasons they tell you they don't want to use sunscreen?
So I think my favorite excuse, and I'm sure all of you guys get this too, is I'm not out in the sun. So then I say, well, how did you get here today? So we know that incidental sunlight, even low levels, add up over a lifetime. And I think we just need to really dispel these misconceptions and make sure that patients understand that, even driving in their car, you can get UV light exposure. It penetrates right through window glass. Getting in and out of the subway, in and out of the car, it really adds up. And make sure that they know that, you visited me, not in a bubble today. You got to my office somehow, so you were exposed to the sun.
Do that. Okay, well, let's look at our next question. And, patients, they're going to go out in the sun. We can't tell. I always kid my patients that I say you can't be a vampire and only come out at night. We don't expect that. I think they think dermatologists suggest that. But they have to do it logically and with common sense. So how do you discuss this with your patients to give a good balance between the benefits of being outdoors with the benefits certainly of protection?
Well, I'll start. I know there's some early evidence that even suggests for young children, if they go out in the sun, they have better ocular development and they have perhaps less nearsightedness. That's a new phenomenon. So I really do encourage that there be outdoor activity. We don't want children being obese. We don't want children who don't play and develop activities and sports and hobbies that allow them to lead an active lifestyle. But we do want to educate them about photoprotection. And I think going through what they like and don't like about a sunscreen can be very helpful. I do talk to them about how to apply the sunscreen effectively. And if they're worried about it running in their eyes, we might use a stick down to the eye level, and then use perhaps another formulation of sunscreen in other body parts, so that tolerance is very good. Also, the stick formulations are very good on lips, reapplication for noses, and on the ears. That really can just smooth over some of the challenges that they have perceived prior to the visit that they've had with me in the office.
Steve?
And I think one of the things is I think we need to downplay the anxiety that people have. You know, I work in the skin cancer center, and everyone coming in, they're absolutely scared. And I try to sort of mitigate their anxiety level. And I explain to them, you know, go out and enjoy the sun, exactly for all the benefit we just talked about. But do so in a responsible and moderate fashion. And that's the key. Because if we tell people don't go out in the sun, that's not possible, right? So no one's going to do it. So they may sort of leave your office, practice that for a week, but it's not going to be a habit that can be built. So 3 months later, they're going to go back to the old state, right? And the thing is, I focus on the mother. I mean, I think in any family unit, it's the mother that's the most instrumental. The woman of the family that will tell the husband what to do, and they're the ones that's going to put on the sunscreen for the kids, right? But the thing is, now I tell my female patients that is, put on the sunscreen yourself first. Because what happened is, if you just run around on the beach, put the sunscreen on your kids, you are getting sun exposure for the first 20 minutes, right? But if you put on the sunscreen yourself, you set an example for the kids, and the kids will basically model you, right? And that's how the kids learn from everything else. They model our own behavior. So that's some of the message, some of the changes I've been doing.
Josh?
Yeah, so I agree with everything that you guys said. I think one of the biggest motivating factors that we have is resorting to patients' vanity. And there's a lot of data out there, especially in young women, saying that if you put sunscreen on, you will prevent the development of wrinkles. Now listen, whether they get wrinkles or not, that's a totally separate issue. We really care about skin cancers, particularly melanoma. But especially in that younger group who may be more at risk, that college student who's finally on her own and making her own decisions, perhaps they're responsible ones, perhaps they're not responsible ones, resorting, I think, to vanity is actually very, very useful in many cases.
Well, they have to be able to relate to the message. I think
Yeah.
that's key. The Academy did a PSA about a dozen years or so ago, which had the stat, 1 in 5 Americans will get a skin cancer. Will you be the one? And they had 5 teenagers walking down the street, and one kind of looking over his shoulder implying he was the one. So it was a great ad, but they kind of focus tested it afterwards. And when they showed this to teenagers, it didn't work because every teenager knew that they would not be the one. It would be one of the other 4 that would be the one. So again, the message has to connect with that. I think it's important. Okay, let's go to our next question. And this has to do with higher SPF products and why they work. And we have a paper that just got accepted. It's online in JAN. It'll be in the May issue. And we did a study, a split-face, double-blind study comparing SPF 50 to SPF 100 sunscreen. I alluded to that earlier in the meeting. And what we found was on the SPF 50 side of the face, you were 10 times more likely to be sunburned than the SPF 100. A lot of other parameters we checked. We weighed the tubes. There was no difference in usage or reapplications or whatever, or skin types. So clearly there's some benefit to the higher SPF. So what do you think about that, John? We'll start yours well this way this time and see what you think.
So I have a line that I use with all of my patients. A higher SPF product is like an insurance policy to make sure that you get the best quality of protection for the longest period of time. We know that patients, even myself, I'm guilty of it. We're not putting on as much as we should be applying, and we're certainly not reapplying as much as we should. So starting off at a higher level, again, will give you that best protection for the longest period of time.
Steve?
And you're absolutely right? That a study has shown that the real SPF protection you're getting is only about 1/3, 1/2 the labeled SPF. So if you bought a product that has SPF 30, you're really getting SPF 10, right? And in my mind, there are different types of sunscreen. There's daily use for in New York City in the winter versus you come into Hawaii. And SPF 30, I would say even 50, when you come to Hawaii, it's just not going to do the job, and you will get burned. And also there's something else that we don't talk about, and we always think about SPF is thinking about UVB protection. And there's also another element of the UVA protection. Once you increase the SPF, and the UVA protection will also go up, because nowadays the sunscreen have to pass the critical wavelength test. And the critical wavelength test is tied in directly to the SPF measurement.
Beta?
And I feel that because children are the ones who probably get the most sun exposure. I live in Texas, they all live in New York, so it's a little different amount of light that we have. We have 4 seasons, you know, basically sunshine pretty much all year round, and it's warm, and people do spend a great deal of time outside. But because we know so much of the sun damage occurs in the very earliest years of life, I really want to emphasize high SPF use for all the reasons my colleagues have mentioned, but mostly because I think people don't apply enough, so we want to ensure that they get the best amount of protection that we can possibly allow them to have, and a higher SPF does that for us.
All right, well that kind of tees up the next question perfectly, because we think of the universe of patients that we have, but there are special subset populations that we really have to, I think, focus our message on to really get it to be effective. Excuse me, and certainly the first group would be the pediatric group, so maybe you want to comment on that.
One of the things I like to emphasize is it's not just my Fitzpatrick 1 through 3 group that I'm talking about sunscreens to. It's all children, regardless of their Fitzpatrick skin type, because the sun in Texas is very intense, and our dark-skinned patients can get sunburns just as much if they stay out long enough as our more fair-skinned patients. So we want those children to get protection as well. I also treat patients who have rosacea. These are older patients, and we know that sometimes if they wear a chemical sunscreen, which allows absorption of the light, they'll feel that their rosacea is flaring or that their skin feels more warm. So in that population, I'll suggest that they use a titanium or zinc oxide reflective type sunscreen, and they often tolerate that and like it a lot more because of the cosmetic impact.
Steve?
I think it's, we sort of touched upon that a little bit. I think when we tell a patient a message, the message has to resonate with that individual. And I think a lot of times that we are just creatures of habits, and we don't make decisions based on rational thoughts, right? And you have to say something that touch upon the fear and dreams and hope of the individual in front of you. And
hard to do that for a kid, but
no, hard to do that for a kid. Kid is
it's not that hard.
But
they have as many fears, they have more hope.
So the individuals population I deal with a lot is elderly individuals with skin cancer. One subgroup is the elderly man. They're about, let's say, 70 years old. You just did 3 Mohs surgery over the last year, and you taught them about skin cancer prevention, and they nod, they say yes, yes, but 6 months later they came back completely burned. I mean, like, you ask them, like, don't you remember what we did to you? And the guy goes, yeah, but, you know, it wasn't that bad, I have you, right? So then I looked over to the wife and sitting there, and she just shakes her head. And so at this moment, like, it doesn't matter what I say, because the guy is not going to listen, because the wife's been married for 40 years has not made an impact, and I certainly cannot make an impact, right? Yeah. And so what I do is, so I turn around and say, do you have any grandkids? And it goes, yes. I said, can you just please set a good example for your grandkids, right? And I don't care what you do, but when you are with your grandkids, please wear a hat and closing your sunscreen, because you don't want them to develop the skin cancer when they're turning 30, right? So what I'm doing there is try to use guilt, right? So, and you have to use some sort of mechanism, some sort of message that resonate with that individual, right? And that's my message, my tip.
Well, that's always hard. I mean, I have a couple of patients who basically says their job is to enjoy themselves in the sun and grow skin cancers, and my job is to get rid of them so they don't die, right?
Yes.
So, very simple relationship that we have. But it's very hard to reach that group. I mean, everything you say is very true. Josh?
Yeah, so I agree with Steve. I think it's about tailoring the message specifically to the group that you're dealing with. So when you're speaking about men, you want to incorporate sunscreen into the daily routine. So what does the man do almost every day? They shave. And what are you doing after shaving? You're applying an aftershave lotion. So why can't that aftershave lotion be a moisturizer with SPF? So tying that into what they're doing. If you're talking about darker skinned individuals, the big concern is whiteness or ashiness of the skin, and being able to give specific recommendations for products that fully absorb. And then you can tailor your recommendations depending on the particular group that you have, so that that particular person can easily incorporate it into his or her daily routine.
I'd just like to add that you can sort of play this dynamic relationship between the family members sitting in the room, right? And I mentioned if the wife is sitting there, and women, I think, by far are more complex compliant, number one, and number two is most of the time they sort of quote unquote nag the husband, right? So what I do is I just encourage that behavior.
Never nags me. Never.
And I just
She's
basically
wonderful.
encourage
She's the
that
best
behavior. I
one.
says keep reminding him, and I turn to the husband and says, listen to your wife, you will be a happier man. But so that's another tip.
And especially with families, you know, the moms and the dads are very good at applying the sunscreen on the kids, but, you know, explain to them that they have a responsibility not only to take care of their children, but to take care of themselves so that they're healthy for the future, and to use the same rules that they, you know, have for their kids for themselves. Frequently at the beach, you know, what I do myself with my kids and my family is I set a timer on my telephone. So every 2 hours it beeps, because otherwise you get really distracted, and that's another tip that you can give, you know, for busy families.
That's a great idea. In fact, there's some other, those color-changing devices, those wristbands and stuff, which are sort of qualitative, but also remind people to do that too. I guess two other subgroups I think that are important. One is people who have already had skin cancer. There's this data out there, several studies that show when you're diagnosed, for the first year you take more photoprotective measures. By 1 year out, you're back to where you were, and by 2 years, you're almost below where you were before you were diagnosed. So how do you motivate them to continue to motivate them to have that behavioral change that they start off with, but they lose?
Sure. So listen, the glass may be 80% full, which represents your cumulative lifetime exposure to sun, but you don't want the glass to overflow. So we can't undo what's been done, but you certainly can prevent adding more water to the glass.
And I think there's another group that people with transplants, kidney transplant, cardiac transplant, those are really high-risk individuals. And I find those group of patients are very motivated. And what I try to do is, you know, I try to make them feel better, because I try to explain to them, you know, part of the disease mechanism is due to their immune suppression, right? But getting back to you, to talking about how do you motivate the other group, I really think there's a kind of a disconnect between knowledge and behavior, right? And this gap in the middle, and sometimes, you know, you can rationalize all you want, you can motivate them all you want, but the traditional motivation triggers is not going to cut it. I think you have to impact their surrounding environment, and you have to create this entire chain of sequence of action, and you get them to knock down the first step. The first step could be very simple, minimal, and once you do that, it triggers an entire reaction, and that's what we have to think about.
And I think one of the challenges we have too is that the other side, we'll call them the dark side, literally, they have an easy soundbite. They can say, it feels good to lie in the sun, right? I don't care. We can't respond to the soundbite. I've always thought about how to do that, but it's a complex response. You can't just put it in one soundbite to do it. I think that's one of the challenges we face. And the other special population I wanted to touch on was adolescents. So I'm going to get your views on this, Mina, because you deal with them a lot.
Right. I generally, one of the things I actually do is I ask my young patients, how old do you think I am? I get a really broad range of answers, but usually it's pretty good. Anything under 40, golden. That's my patient forever. I will always love them and care for them. But I often show them my hands. I don't have any lenigos on the back of my hands. Sometimes I compare the back of my hand to the mother's hand or the grandmother's hand, whoever has brought them in. And I'll say, what do you think made this difference? And the difference is that I've worn sunscreens since my 20s. I wasn't just studying in the library, although I did a lot of that too. I was actually putting sunscreen on. And I think, again, appealing to these adolescents, especially the girls, it's harder for the boys, telling them by wearing a sunscreen every day, they will have less wrinkles. They'll need me less as they grow up, at least from the cosmetic aspect. For the boys, I ask, who is the team sport individual that you really admire? When did you last see them on television or in a magazine? How did their skin look? Don't you think they take care of their skin? Don't you want to, when you become the athlete of the year, want to look good when you're represented publicly just like they are? Of course, every kid thinks that that's exactly what will happen. And we just try to encourage them somewhat from a vanity standpoint, but whatever works, if that's what gets them to use the sunscreen, I think we just have to empower them to do it.
Steve?
For adolescents, I think it's really challenging, and I think you're dealing with a segment of the population during that age, they're completely fearless, right? And they're thinking about, they're not thinking about mortality, they're not thinking about melanoma, they're not thinking about any of this stuff. And the peer pressure the prom, the boyfriend, and their Facebook likes, that's what's occupying their mindset, right? Again, Josh talked about appealing to the age and the appearance for the female, for the young girls. And I think the opportunity really lies in how do we leverage technology, how do we leverage Instagram, how do we leverage Facebook and to change behavior, right? And I think one of the interesting thing is we always talk about percentage of people don't use sunscreen, percentage of people don't use photo protection. And I think perhaps we should talk about the other side. That is, X percentage of people do use the product. Because one of the example I thought was really interesting is during the 80s, and there's a campaign about just say no for not taking drugs. And they show a lot of a public ad, etc. But what was interesting was it's a very well received, but then you look at the usage of drug, it just increased. And then one of the potential side effects is you're telling people don't use drug, everything else, and you got a whole bunch of teenagers sitting in the back and thinking, oh my God, what is this drug? And then now they made it like noticed, right? So likewise, I think if you tell people, less than 30% of people use sunscreen, but then they think this is the norm. The norm is don't use sunscreen, right? If we somehow tell people that, sunscreen is used at least once a day or something like this, and then people think this is accepted behavior, maybe that will shift.
That's an interesting point, interesting way to review it and reverse it in a sense.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think it's an idea of we want to, I think in the adolescent state and the people follow peer pressure, they want to follow what other people are doing. If the normal quote-unquote state is no one uses sunscreen, so then I better belong in this don't use group. But if somehow we tell people X percentage of people, you'd be surprised that many people are actually using sun protection, maybe somehow we can shift behavior. And again, I think a lot of times we have to tap into the psychology, looking into how psychology is being used for anti-smoking, other kind of public campaign. Because sometimes we think there's something that's very logical, rational, it may backfire.
Josh?
I think getting the patients that I see in the office to use sunscreen is the easy part, because who are these adolescents? It's our acne patients. And we can discuss with them sun sensitivity from acne medications and the need for moisturizers. I think the big issue is more what Steve is talking about here. It's changing behaviors in the public, because the overwhelming majority of adolescents are not being seen in our office. And social media campaigns, I think would be really useful. High-profile individuals and celebrities sending a positive message, I think in some ways is what may be needed to affect change.
It is interesting because there was a shift about a decade ago towards advertising with having people with less tan, let's call it. Then I think it went back the other way a little bit. So maybe we can influence that to some extent as dermatologists and through the Academy and other groups that really work on doing this. All right, we'll go to our next question, which I think is the fun one. And I've asked each of you to come up with one tip that you think is most effective in motivating your patients to be sun safe and protect themselves. So a patient who is like totally recalcitrant, and what's the tip? I'll start with you, Josh.
I came up with all my one-liners already. Let me think. I think the point is that patients should be sun safe in general, and sunscreen is just one part of sun protective behavior. And I think that's what we need to educate our patients on. It's okay to go out in the sun. It's okay to enjoy yourself. You just have to do it in a smart way. And we all know about trying to avoid sun during peak hours, sun protective clothing, hats, glasses, and of course sunscreen. And then I think I'm all out of my other fun, motivating ideas.
Steve?
So I sort of tried to have a dialogue, right? I said, I understand you're not going to listen to me, basically. But once you set the expectation
low, that sounds like all my patients, right?
Once you set the expectation low, you may surprise yourself with the success. So I said, listen, do me a favor, can you please just use a sunscreen every morning after you're brushing your teeth, before you're leaving your bathroom. Just do it for me for 60 days. Right? I tell you why I do this. Because one is I want to create a habit. Right? I keep talking about this habit. Right? And the idea is you want to put individual into a right context, where they're going to do it, how they're going to do it, and in what context are they going to do it, and follow what other triggers are they going to do it, right? So you tell them in the morning, and you tell them after they brush their teeth, you tell them before they leave the bathroom, so you basically lock them up basically in this environment. That is, you can't leave the bathroom until you put this down, right? And you tell them to do it for 60 days, because in some of the behavioral biological psychology study, they've shown that the average time it takes to get someone to create a new habit is 60 days, all right? And the idea here is that we as a human beings are creatures of habit, that we don't have the discipline or the willpower to change behavior. And that's why diet fails, that's why we cannot stop smoking, and that's why we cannot go exercise, right? So you tell them that basically do 60 days so that we basically, you create this action, create enough discipline, get them to create this first habit, right? So they're going to use the sunscreen, hopefully, and I told them, I said, can you promise me you're going to do that? They probably say, yes, okay. Then they go, right? The whole idea is if I get them to do that for that 60 days, chances are they created this habit, chances are they're going to go out and start thinking about the interaction with the sun. And this is the same idea I mentioned earlier about a Dale Green study where SPF 16, poor bad UVA protection, after 10 years, reduced skin cancer.
Dramatically, and melanoma risk was reduced in half,
50%,
and invasive melanoma risk was reduced 75%.
Yep.
So it was actually, this was done in Australia, a very dramatic study. Beta?
I think I set the stage to tell parents when I'm dealing with their children and educating them about sunscreen use is that most parents are not aware that it's the earliest years of life that allow the greatest cumulative accumulation of photo damage, and that they may not see the effect for many years down the line. I often use the dental model too. You go see the dentist twice a year, so you have a lifelong history of healthy teeth. It's not because you necessarily have disease. My goal is not to have to bring you bad news that you have a precancer or a skin cancer. My job is to help prevent it. But I really want to talk to the parents that these early years are the most impactful years. And again, learning that habit, just like learning to brush your teeth, go to the dentist, wear a seatbelt, all of those are habits that indeed we teach as parents to our children. So I try to go over that and reiterate it as much as I can on every visit. And I think we have wonderful opportunities, even if they don't listen. I still think we have the obligation to discuss the importance of sunscreen use, especially at an early age for the patients that we serve.
So I think my biggest success is when I try to figure out a way to at least get a balance with the patient, because we alluded to this earlier, you can't force people not to go outside. You can say, I refuse to lock you, I'll lock you in, I'll never let you out. People are not going to do that. So I say you can go outside, healthy behavior is good, exercise is good, but basically do a balance. Don't lie on the beach and bake for baking's sake. You know, at least get some benefit out of your time outdoors. And also, there's no downside to lowering your risk for these other bad things while you're doing things outdoors, like wearing sunscreen and protect yourself. The other challenging group, I think, is the adolescents. And I know the Academy's tried this in a number of ways, and many other groups have tried it. The only message I think that partially has worked for me is telling a teenager when you're 30, you're going to look 50. Because 30 is a curse already when you're a teenager, right? And you can look 50, my God, you know, that's awful. But that sometimes reaches them a little bit, the wrinkle which with it. So,
and you know, Daryl, the only other tip that has actually worked in my practice is accountability. You know, if you make sure that patients are accountable for their actions by making them come back into the office, maybe a little bit earlier than you would otherwise, that really helps. So during the summer, that older guy with the sun damage, you know, if I want to see him back in 3 or 4 weeks, then just like going to the dentist, you're going to floss before, the same thing in terms of your sunscreen coming back into the dermatologist's office.
So we're going to stop at this point and really review, and I think the message is it's time for all of us to be champions for skin health, because compliance really is, we're forcing it on our patients, it's important. And we have to think about, as we heard the messages today, that our patients need to work on, we can't forget about those special populations that we alluded to really customize the message. And especially for parents, I think it's important to make sure that they protect their children. We showed you that data from the BJD study that basically showed if you protected the children early, you got even a bigger hit in terms of long-term preventative measures. So with that, I want to thank our panel. I hope you've enjoyed the session, and we'll move on to the next panel. Thank you very much.